The UC Federalist Society is proud to welcome Steve Simpson. Steve is a former constitutional litigator with the Institute for Justice and now has spent the last 4 years at the Ayn Rand Institute. He's a lawyer by trade, and he has edited an anthology of free speech topic essays called Defending Free Speech, and we are more than happy to have him here. So without further ado, welcome Steve Simpson.
Hey, thank you. Thanks very much for having me. Thanks to the Federalist Society, among other things, thanks to the Federalist Society for serving free lunch, because I think it always draws more people. I think they do a great job with these, and thanks to Paul for inviting me to speak. It's great to be here to talk about such an important topic as freedom of speech. In general, I'm going to focus mostly on campus issues, on free speech on campus. And with that, given that is where really where all the action is, or a whole lot of the action today on free speech, I want to kind of dive in by setting the context a bit and talking a bit about some examples of the controversies that are going on. I have somewhat unique views on some of these things, so I want to start off with some examples, and then I'll talk a bit about what I think is going on. And by the way, I think the title of this event, Can the First Amendment Tolerate Hate, is a really good title for a lot of reasons that I'll explain as I go through the talk. And let me just dive right in. Just yesterday I read in USA Today about a controversy over a Cornell law professor giving a talk at Vassar College. He was going to go give a talk at Vassar College about free speech. Basically, it was about the First Amendment and what the First Amendment requires or how it applies to college campuses today, and it created a huge controversy at Vassar. There were a group of students who opposed his talk on the First Amendment because they viewed it as offensive, they viewed it as an example of hate speech, or they were worried that it was going to involve hate speech. They started rumors that there were white supremacists coming to campus. They tried to have it canceled. They set up a safe space on campus, literally with coloring books for students who were worried about this. Now, the talk went off okay. There was a protest outside of the talk. The professor ultimately said it was a good experience for him and the students, but he found it very jarring that people would oppose a talk on free speech. So that's just the latest example. Before that, at Rutgers University in New Jersey, there was a panel on identity politics involving multiple speakers, and students rose up during the talk and tried to shout them down, and they actually had to stop the talk many times during the talk. Continuing backward before that, the ACLU, a lawyer from the ACLU, gave a talk at William & Mary Law School in Southern Virginia, and she was basically blocked from speaking. The protesters came up and essentially took the microphone away from her and prevented her from speaking. Now, obviously, that was connected to the Charlottesville riots, but still, she was there to talk about the issue. They prevented her from speaking. Continuing backward in time, at the end of the last semester, I'm sure you've all heard about the controversy at Evergreen State College in Washington, in which students literally took over the campus and threatened with force and violence people like Professor Brett Weinstein, who was a professor of biology there, who opposed what was called a day of absence, which is a day in which all white people were supposed to leave campus. He supported a lot of the issues of inclusiveness, but that one he opposed, and he just opposed it peacefully, disagreed with it, and students went ballistic. They actually threatened his life. He had to stay off of campus in order to preserve his safety. He's since sued, and they've settled, and now he's moving on to another university. Before that, we had a controversy at Claremont McKenna College involving Heather McDonald, who wrote a book called The War on Cops. She's a controversial speaker, a very educated person, whether you agree with her or disagree with her. Students encircled the building that she was supposed to give this talk on and prevented anybody from going inside and watching her talk. They got so violent that campus security, she ended up live streaming the talk, campus security had to end the talk early because they were afraid the students were going to come in and harm her. They had to sort of whisk her off to an undisclosed location. Before that, Charles Murray was blocked from speaking at Middlebury College in Vermont, and then later he and another professor were actually attacked when they were leaving the campus. And then, of course, before that, we had the riots at Berkeley involving Milo Yiannopoulos. So I would say clearly something is up here. What exactly that is, what exactly is going on, is an important question to evaluate. If you look at surveys, I'll just mention one quick survey that the Brookings Institute did on attitudes about free speech on campus. They found that 44% of students don't think that hate speech is protected under the First Amendment. Now, I would add as a sort of footnote to that, there's really no such thing as hate speech as a free speech, as an issue of law. It's not really a category. It's certainly not an exception to the First Amendment. But 44% of students think that it's not protected. 51% think it's okay to disrupt a speaker or a talk by a controversial speaker by shouting them down so no one can hear them. And really troublingly, although this is a small percentage, 19% think that it's appropriate to use violence to stop a talk. Now, you have to take surveys with a kind of grain of salt, but I would think of it like this, and there are other surveys that have showed things that are similar to this. If you think about the examples I gave, and really there are many, many more examples, and then you think about the surveys, there's clearly something wrong going on. There's something odd happening, not just on college campuses, but I think throughout the United States, in our attitude toward freedom of speech and our attitude toward the right to free speech and whether it's a good or a bad thing. And I really think we need to address that. Now, I said that I really like the topic or the title of this talk. I didn't come up with it, Paul I think came up with it. So congratulations, Paul, for coming up with a good title. But here's the reason I like it. Can the First Amendment tolerate hate or tolerate hate speech? Now, I said that that's not really a category, but even if we think about it, I mean, there are things that we can all come up with that are truly offensive speech or false, really awful speech, racist speech, right? I mean, racist speech is offensive, it's false, it's wrong. And the question, if we put it in those terms, so we're not vague about the meaning of hate speech, can the First Amendment tolerate, let's say, racist speech or truly offensive, false speech? And I have two answers to that to kind of kick things off here. And you might think of it as good news, bad news sort of thing. And I'll start with what a lot of people would think of as the bad news. And I don't really think of this as bad news, but I'll explain why I think that. I do think that there's a real problem with people, or that it's appropriate for people to be offended and really outraged by certain kinds of speech. There's no question about that. But my answer is, can the First Amendment tolerate it? Or to that question is, yes, the First Amendment can tolerate it. And by extension, the First Amendment, or if you think about that as a stand-in to the government, meaning the First Amendment is what restrains the government from taking certain kinds of actions, or the Bill of Rights do. The government has to tolerate free speech, okay? You might think of that as the bad news, meaning it has to tolerate hate speech. It has to allow people to engage in hate speech, whether it likes it or not, whether it agrees with the message or not. The good news is, but the rest of us don't have to tolerate it if we don't want to. Now, tolerate is a kind of a vague term. John Locke, who really thought of the issue of toleration, his letter concerning toleration, defined it as the government not shutting down people's speech. Back then it was religious talk, criticizing, or disbelieving in certain kinds of religious issues. He termed it, I think, the right way as tolerance means we are not shutting down physically, or government is not banning free speech. But we can think more broadly in our own view as tolerance means whether I support it or I don't support it as a personal matter. And there are all kinds of things that we can do not to tolerate speech. We can not listen to it if we don't like it. We can not support it with our money if we don't want to support it. We can not attend talks. We can criticize speech. That's a form of not tolerating the speech that we disagree with. And we ought to do that. So my view is not all speech is a value. That's definitely not the case. It is that the freedom to speak, the freedom to listen, the freedom to hear opposing viewpoints is definitely a value. It has to be a right in this society. And I'll explain why I think that's so. And that the government has to keep its hands off of speech in the sense that it can't prevent people from speaking, although one has to make a distinction between speech and action, or speech and violence. And there are ways in which those two things are mixed. Incitement, let's say libel, I'm not going to really get too much into that, but I'm more than happy to answer questions about that. But my point is we have to separate out our own attitudes toward free speech and whether we like or whether we're going to support the speech, and what government does. Now, there are some complicating factors which I want to get into, but let me offer this thought. You've heard perhaps in a lot of these free speech controversies that universities or let me put it more broadly as, we have to, the fact that somebody has a right to free speech doesn't mean somebody else has an obligation to give them a platform. That is true. Now, I'm against the whole no platforming movement to the extent that what it means is literally preventing through physical intrusion somebody from speaking when somebody has given them a forum, say a university has. But the idea that every school, every college, every private institution, every individual has to provide a platform to other people, it's really wrong. And part of the reason that we are going so wrong on free speech is that we mixed a lot of issues together. So that's what I want to get into now. So let me start by talking about what free speech is. Firstly, I think that the problem that we're experiencing in this country is people don't really understand the nature and value of the right to free speech. And in order to really understand it, and in order to support free speech, we have to understand what the right to free speech is all about and why it's valuable. So let me start by just putting it simply. The right to free speech means that you get to say whatever you want so long as you don't violate the rights of others, incitement, let's say, or attacking other people, libel. Again, let's put those aside because it's a relatively small category of things. You get to say whatever you want, but there's a big caveat to that, and government can't interfere with it. But the caveat is, as I said before, nobody owes you a microphone. Nobody owes you a forum. Nobody owes you some, enhancement to the volume of your voice. Whether you are heard, whether you have a place to speak, whether you have an audience to speak to, that's on you. And the problem comes up when we mix those together, right? So one of the ways in which we have a real problem today is that there is law on the books, and I disagree with this law, and we'll get into that a bit, and hopefully I'll get some questions. That when we have, if we essentially hold that the right to free speech means that government has to provide people with a forum, essentially at taxpayer expense, we create an inherent clash of values. Why? Because some taxpayers, think of the people in Charlottesville. The people of Charlottesville rightly don't want white supremacists coming to their town and taking it over effectively so that they can have a gang war. We can talk more about that. But even if you think about it from the standpoint of universities or any public forum, what is happening in that context is taxpayers and others are, in essence, forced to finance speech with which they disagree. That's a real problem. Thomas Jefferson once pointed out that forcing someone to finance speech with which he disagrees is deplorable, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. But we're not making that distinction. So let me talk a bit about what is the value of free speech. Why do we protect free speech? It's often just taken as a given, right? Free speech is just one of these fundamental values in America, and it has to be protected. Why? Well, I don't know. Either it's a tradition, right? Or oftentimes the argument that we hear is if we don't protect free speech, we can't arrive at truth, right? So there's this idea that truth is arrived at collectively, that we have this thing called the marketplace of ideas, and if we can't hear all voices, we can't really understand truth, and we can't govern ourselves. Now, there's a whole lot of truth to that idea, but I think there's something fundamentally wrong with it. I take a very individualistic, or at least I start with the individual, and I think that that's the appropriate way to think about free speech. The value of free speech and the right to free speech starts with the individual. Now, by the individual, I mean all individuals, like the sort of the essential elements of what it is to be an individual. So why we protect free speech is this. Thinking and freedom to think your own thoughts and arrive at your own conclusions is absolutely essential to living a human life, a proper human life. You cannot function if you can't think, if you can't arrive at your own conclusions, if you can't think and then direct your own behavior. If we think of the development of civilization, The development of civilization in any time period in history happens because people are applying thought to the problems of their life, whether it's inventing things, whether it's coming up with new forms of government, whether it's just understanding that the old forms of government are problematic. They have to be able to think, they have to be able to apply their minds to the facts and to the world around them and arrive at their own conclusions. This is an act of choice, ultimately. This is an act that each of us as individuals are responsible for. You think about learning the law. You have to engage in tons of really hard thinking, and you have to choose to do it. I was in law school, and I can remember the pull of watching TV instead of studying, or going out to a bar instead of studying, or doing anything instead of studying, because studying is hard, right? When you make that decision, finally I'm going to shut the TV off, I'm going to block out all other things, and I'm going to go hit the case books, and I'm going to start reading. That's an act of choice. Imagine if someone tried to force you to do that, right? If they came in with guns and said you have to learn torts or civil procedure, or minimum contacts, or any element of jurisdiction or federal courts, and we're going to put a gun against your head, and you have to learn it. So I'm just going to preach to you all of these doctrines, and I'm going to ask you questions at the end of the lecture, and if you don't answer the way I want to, you're all going to be shot. Right? It's an extreme hypothetical, obviously, but what would everybody do? They would just parrot back the information that the professor said. Would they understand it? No, of course not. They would just be saying exactly what the person told them to say. There are actually countries in which this is true. North Korea is the perfect example of that, where everybody just parrots back what the government tells them to think. Do they really believe it? No, of course they don't really believe it. You cannot force people to think. You can't force them to learn. You can't force them to arrive at even what are true conclusions. Any effort to try to do that destroys their ability to think, right? Because they ultimately just become a kind of, put it as like a robot, or they're just a mouthpiece for your ideas. They don't really understand it themselves. They're just parroting back information. You can't live a full human life if you don't have the ability to choose what to think on your own. If you don't have the ability to come to your own conclusions, which means if you don't have the ability to make mistakes. Part of learning is making mistakes. Part of learning is encountering false ideas, right? If you look at the history of the development of science, we have Galileo, right? Understanding that, no, the Earth is not the center of the universe. The sun is the center, at least, of the solar system. The planets move around that, right? But encountering that and really thinking that through and making errors, and if you look at the history of science, science is rife with all kinds of mistakes and people grappling with those mistakes and thinking, which is true? Is it this or is it that? I have to make a choice. I have to think it through. And it's often important to see falsity in order to understand what is true. And that's definitely true in the development of human thinking. So my perspective on this is freedom of speech is a kind of corollary to freedom of thought. So not only do you think for yourself, but you trade ideas with other people. That's what I'm doing right now, right? And that's a good thing. We couldn't have a society such as we have today without the freedom to communicate information. Our society is built on cooperation, interaction among human beings. And what that necessarily means is speaking to other people. Right? So we have to have the freedom not only to think for ourselves, but to communicate those ideas to other people and be communicated in return. That's what the First Amendment is all about. It is protecting that freedom to speak. And it arises in a context in which that freedom was not protected. In England at the time of the Revolutionary War, but you can take that all the way back throughout world history. There was always some authority. Typically it was the government or the church that was trying to control what people thought. And what that leads to ultimately is a kind of dictatorship, totalitarianism. And in every one of these societies, life is, to put it very mildly, not good. Okay? Life is not good in a society in which censorship prevails and anyone tries to control thought. That's the reason to have freedom of speech. And it's the reason to protect even the ideas that we hate. Because if we try to control those ideas, we are not stamping them out of existence. We are just forcing people to take them underground, in effect. People are going to continue to believe bad things, even if you try to force them. In fact, I would argue that people are more likely to stick with their bad ideas, if you try to compel them to give them up. And I actually think we're seeing that in Europe now. So Europe has hate speech laws. Europe has Holocaust denial laws. It hasn't caused anti-Semitism to go away, say in Germany. If anything, tribalism and factional fighting, racism, that groupthink is on the rise. It's not just in Europe, it's here too. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that, but at least we can see that hate speech laws haven't solved this problem. They couldn't solve this problem. Restricting speech cannot cause people to think the right way. And so that's the ultimate foundation for freedom of speech. It's the freedom to think and arrive at your own conclusions. And yes, be wrong sometimes, and then be able to discuss with other people about whether you're wrong. But it also involves the freedom, and it has to involve the freedom to engage with other people, and importantly, to not engage with them. What do you do when you face off with a guy like Richard Spencer? You know, Richard Spencer is going to go give a talk somewhere. Everybody know who Richard Spencer is? He's the white man. Okay. I kind of figured everybody knew who he was. So what happens when he is going to give a talk somewhere? The proper response, in my view, is shun him. Don't go. Write articles about how stupid he is and how horrifying his ideas are. Don't give him a microphone. Don't support his speech. If he wants to try to get his speech out there and get his views out there, that's on him. If he does it on his own time, with his own money, is actually able to get an audience, then you oppose him with more speech. So the idea that the proper response to free speech that we hate is more speech is definitely true. But there's another component to it, which is part of the proper response to speech we hate, is don't support it. Now that doesn't mean attack the speaker. He has the right to give a talk if he can get an audience. Now here's something he doesn't have the right to, in my view. Although this is a very muddled part of First Amendment law. He does not have a right, if we really understand what a right is, which is an entitlement to take certain kinds of actions just by virtue of the fact that you exist, right? You have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That means you have a right to sustain your life. You have the liberty, the freedom to sustain your life, and then to pursue your own happiness. But that can't be at the expense of other people's rights. It can't mean that if I have the right to live my life, I also have the right to force you to live for me. And a version of that is slavery, right? And it's a horrifying thing. Now there are all kinds of other ways that people and governments can violate this. But here's the problem. If we say to the Richard Spencers of the world, you have a right to spew your hate at public expense, what do the rest of the people out there who, oppose his ideas, what is their natural reaction going to be? You're basically using my tax dollars or my public square or my streets to come spew your hate. I think it's appropriately, this is an outrage. I don't want to let them do that. If I live in Charlottesville, my attitude toward the white supremacists in Charlottesville would be, what the hell are white supremacists doing in my town? Now, if they want to rent a theater somewhere and give a talk, we can all shun them and not pay attention to them. If they are allowed to give a talk in the public square at public expense, it creates an inherent clash of rights. Because the townspeople and anybody else who's a taxpayer says, I don't want to finance this, but I'm being forced to finance it. So what do I want to do? I'm going to go out and I'm going to oppose it. And pretty soon you get the kind of clashes that we have. Now this is a long-standing problem in America. And my point is not that First Amendment law should just say the really bad speakers aren't allowed to speak in the public square. It's true, and it is proper for the First Amendment to say, look, if we are going to offer a public square to speakers, we cannot make content-based distinctions among them, because that's the government essentially involving itself in ideas. But there's another approach to this, which would be, don't have public squares and finance people's speech, when we have to start questioning that idea. Now, this also applies to the public university. There's a real problem with having public universities at all. Now, I have no illusions that public universities are going to go away, and my point is not oftentimes when I make that, and I'm at a public university, people say, you want to get rid of University of Cincinnati, you want it to go away. No, I don't want it to go away. I would privatize it. It would be my ultimate solution to the problems that public universities pose, frankly, all public schools. Now, leave aside, okay, so that's utopian, right? In the sense that it ain't happening anytime soon. It's not going to happen in my lifetime. So I'm not, I don't have any illusions about the idea that we're just going to privatize all the universities and all the schools. But what I'm trying to convey is having public universities, having public squares where we allow people and we apply the First Amendment creates an inherent conflict. And part of the reason that we're seeing conflicts on campuses is just that. There's a right for Milo to go speak at the University of California, Berkeley, and all of the students who don't like his speech and are really opposed to him, they are going to properly get riled up by that. And so are the townspeople. There's something wrong in the idea that my support is essentially, I'm forced to support this guy that I hate. Even if, and there are all kinds of, you can take that in all kinds of directions. I mean, that's not to say that, I think oftentimes people should embrace speakers in certain contexts because their speech is actually intelligent, good, and I would support it. But ultimately, that's my decision. That should be my decision to support them or not to support them. I shouldn't be able to force all the rest of you guys to fund or support the speech that I favor. It's ultimately up to me if I want to convince people to get the forum and then to try to get you guys to come to the talk, you know, whether we have to ply you with food or just the interest of the talk. It's up to me as an individual to get the audience and then to try to convince them. The government should have no role in that. When the government does have a role in it, it creates a serious problem. And it's an intractable problem. And we have to, if we're really going to grapple with this issue of conflicts of free speech, we've got to grapple with that problem. We've got to have, I think, at the very least, more intelligent rules that apply to the public square and public universities. Now, I don't want to get too deeply into the legal aspects, but probably you've all heard of the idea of a public forum. A public forum is a forum that government sets up specifically for speech. And in a public forum, the government cannot make content or viewpoint distinctions. It can't say Richard Spencer can't talk, but Black Lives Matter can, let's say. It's got to be neutral. And I think that's appropriate. I think it's the only way to manage that. But I do question the idea that every public space is a public forum. I really think there's something seriously wrong with that. What is the purpose of a university? So my approach to this would be very much a kind of form follows function analysis. That is, you have to think about what the purpose of the space is before you decide whether it's a public forum. The streets are not a public forum. And allowing people to march down the streets, block traffic, that's a real problem. That's a circumstance in which some people's right to free speech, or quote right to free speech, or exercise of what they say is free speech clashes with other people's rights, which can only cause real conflict and real disagreements. I mean, we've seen that now. Heck, we saw it before Trump was elected. We've seen it since Trump is has been elected, right? And it's only gotten worse since Trump was elected. I understand the desire to oppose Donald Trump in every way possible. I think he's a horrible person and a horrible president. But that doesn't give people the right to clog the streets and prevent, you know, Trump supporters from going to Trump rallies. And it's the same way with, you know, regardless of what the context is. So I think you have to look at things like streets, sidewalks as they have a particular purpose. It's proper for government to designate certain spaces as public fora, right, like the National Mall. But it can't be, in my view, that you allow people to march and to essentially have gang wars. That's what happened in Charlottesville. It was basically a gang war, right? And it wasn't just, oh, these two factions happened to run run into each other, and then it just happened to erupt into violence. They came there planning for violence. And you can see that in what the Charlottesville quote protesters, how they came, the white supremacists, how they came to that event, dressed in helmets with shields and signs that instead of normal sticks just happened to be baseball bats. Because like I couldn't find a stick anywhere, so I had to make my sign out of a baseball bat. That's nonsense. They came ready for a war. So did Antifa. There's something inherently wrong with the idea that a public space can be used forth gang violence. Imagine if in LA the cops said, you know, we're going to designate a certain spot for the Crips and the Bloods to square off against each other and murder each other, and then we'll just stand back and we'll let them do that. That would be crazy. That's not speech. Action is not speech. Speech is the communication of ideas and other peaceful, peaceful, non-sort of active action or non-activity type of actions, so to speak, that communicate ideas. It's not the same thing as saying, a march is not the same thing as speech. And we've got to make that distinction. If we conflate those two things, then we end up with a situation like Charlottesville. And that's a really serious problem. Because and I'll close with this, here's the reason I think that people, or one of the real reasons that people are opposing free speech. If you think that somebody's right to free speech essentially means either that your rights are going to be violated or threatened, and I think that the march by the white supremacists and Antifa, by the way, I regard them both as morally equivalent. There was a big dispute over that. They are exactly the same. But if you really think, no matter which side of that conflict you're on, that my right to free speech, that somebody else's right to free speech means white supremacists or any violent faction can come to my town, take over our property, threaten us, and then ultimately kill not just one person, but 3 people. The other 2 were the 2 police officers that crashed in the helicopter crash, right? That's on the protesters, in my view. If you actually come to equate violence with free speech, what is the rational thing to do in that circumstance? If you're just average Joe citizen, if you really think that speech means constant clashes, constant snarling of traffic, constant attacks and violent clashes, I think it is quite sensible to say, well, to hell with free speech. But it doesn't have to be that way. If we understand the nature of free speech, which is that you have the freedom to speak, but you don't get provided a forum at someone else's expense, you don't get to march on other people's property, you don't get to clash in gang fights with other people, and ultimately, you don't get to be provided with a forum within the university. Then we have a notion of free speech that respects everybody's rights, that makes people's rights consistent with one another. If you want to speak, you can speak, as long as it's on the basis of your effort and on your dime. If I want to speak, I can do it. But your right to free speech doesn't give you the right to demand that I either pay for it or that I clear off of public land or that the government provide you with a forum. That's a real problem. And it's led to all of the kinds of conflicts, I think, or that's part of what's led to the conflicts. I mean, there's a whole other issue of the ideas that are motivating these conflicts, and we can talk about that a bit in the question and answer period. But we've got to make that distinction. Now, one final word. It is, even in the context of, say, a university in which somebody is speaking, if the university gives somebody a forum for speaking and students attack that person or they physically block them in some way or they shout them down, that is and has to be viewed as a violation of at least the property rights of the university. Your right to free speech doesn't give you the right to shout down other speakers, at least not if you're on someone else's property when it's going on. And the fact that a lot of universities have treated this as an exercise of free speech, again, sets up an inherent conflict. It's the idea that if I want to speak and you want to speak at exactly the same time in exactly the same context, well, it's all free speech, and then we just sit and we yell at each other. We need things like property rights. We need things like who has the right to the forum at this point in time, and those ideas in order to mediate those kinds of disputes. So it is possible, certainly, I think, for students on campus to violate the rights of speakers, but oftentimes, a lot of these conflicts, they're not really conflicts of free speech. They're disagreements over the ideas. So if you go into a college classroom and or into your classroom and your professor disagrees with you or won't allow you to speak in class, that's not a violation of your right to free speech. It may be annoying, it may be stupid, it may be impolite, but it's not a violation of your rights because you don't have in that context an actual right to speak. Okay, let me end there, and I'll take questions, and I hope there are a number of them, or many, and we can continue on with questions. So thank you. Questions? Sure.
I kind of missed the beginning of the lecture because I was a professor, so I'm sorry if I'm not going to repeat some stuff. I have a few reactions. One is about your, I don't know, maybe you talked about it in the beginning, but is there a place, I mean, I think there's a place and value to a conversation about the victims of that speech, whether it's free or not only about the speaker. And so, and I think that's what's missing there, because we're also supposed to protect people from the offenses that happen through speech. And so where does that conversation start? The second, kind of question and reaction is about speech should not be kind of an action, it should be speech. Right? I feel like maybe as a white man who has affluent background or is living an affluent life, it is easy for you to say that. But I think that for people who are really affected by it, action is all you got. Because your words, your books, your research, all of this stuff are ignored. So what you need to do, you need to cause some type of disturbance. I want to go break some things because I'm not heard when I'm speaking, so I want to speak through my actions. And the third thing is, yeah, just go ahead.
All right, so let me take the second one. So the second one is, for some people, action is the only choice. And the first question, I think, was, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the first one. Oh, yeah. So the victims of offensive speech. And what do we do about that? Actually, let me start on that. So, first of all, absent any use of force or violence, I question when you say the victims of offensive speech. But it's a kind of a complex issue. And I recognize, so there's no question that there is speech that is hateful, outrageous, wrong, false, that we should oppose, right? There's no question about that. Racist speech is the perfect example of that. Anti-Semitic speech is another really good example. But we've got to take a look at a handful of things. First of all, again, I covered part of this. We have to allow individuals to arrive at their own conclusions, to have their freedom to think, even if what they think is stupid and horrible. And the way we deal with that is by disassociating ourselves from them and essentially morally censuring them, meaning they're horrible, don't anybody deal with them. The worst thing we can do is give them a paid public forum. One of the reasons I think that horrible ideas are allowed to gain currency in a society is because government continues to give them essentially a paid public forum. So part of how would the white supremacists get as much publicity? I mean, they could not possibly get the publicity that they have gotten if they weren't allowed to march on public property in Charlottesville or, say, all of the other places. Because it creates a controversy, it creates a media spectacle, and now they get literally millions and millions of dollars of free publicity. Why is it that the government is giving them a public forum at public expense so they can get tons of publicity for their horrible ideas? There's something inherently wrong with that. And I think if we think about the right to free speech, it doesn't include that. So that is government, in effect, supporting bad ideas. That's what's going on. Government is supporting bad ideas. The best way to allow bad ideas to die is not to give them support. The worst thing you can do is to establish principles by which your government has to give them support. Because that's essentially forced support by the public. That's a really bad idea. Now that dovetails with your second. Now that's not the only thing I would say we do about the victims of hate speech, but we have to think about what it really means to be a victim. As long as we make a proper distinction between speech and action, then the actual ability of individuals with bad ideas to victimize other people, I think, is effectively zero. Now, you have to really make that distinction. So The right to free speech doesn't mean I have the right to burn a cross on your lawn or to burn a cross in an area that is a clear threat or effort at intimidating people. That's a different category. So we have to understand threats, intimidation, harassment. All of these things are proper things for the law to prescribe. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the details of what those things mean, but definitely this is part of the reason to draw a distinction between speech and action. It's only action that can actually oppress you. Saying you're a victim of speech, I think, is a vague term that we have to be very careful about. Even being outraged and hot and extremely pissed off and extremely angry is not the same thing as victimhood. You always have the freedom to walk away, to join with others, to write articles, to explain exactly what's wrong. And that dovetails with the second thing, the idea that, now first I reject the idea that people cannot speak unless they can engage in action. And I definitely reject the idea that part of that action has to be going around and breaking things to get attention. That's chaos. That's anarchism. And if you allow that to happen, you end up exactly where we are today. Or not, hell, you end up way worse than we are today. Anarchism is the end of all rights. It doesn't matter if it's by the poor, if it's by the rich, if it's by the middle class, if it's by black people, if it's by white people, it's by an oppressed group or a non-oppressed group. Anarchism is everybody loses. There is no way to make that consistent with a free society because no one will stand for that. That is the beginning of factional conflict. That is what causes this, what I think today what we're seeing, I would broaden it from race issues or class issues to just tribalism. It's people dividing themselves into groups and deciding the only way I can live a proper life in the society is to go to war with other factions. And we're seeing that increasingly the world over. It is and should be seen as a horrifying thing. That's what happens when you mix speech and action. If you're going to protect freedom, you've got to protect people's freedom to speak and their freedom to live their lives and not allow any area to turn into an effective war zone. And if you want to put it in terms of say, rich people or poor people, it is always, 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 in every society, everywhere in history, that when the rule of law is degraded, it is the people least able to protect themselves, those lowest on the socioeconomic ladder, who always get screwed, always. But I want to go on to other questions. I'll let you follow up on that if there's time. But I want to go on to other questions. I think you had your hand.
Yeah, I have a question about separating speech from action, and how when you focus on speech, you feel like there's not as much of victim in that circumstance. How would you deal with the idea of how hate speech can lead to both group polarization, confirmation bias, and the fact that you see kids that are being swayed by hate speech and grow up in a radicalized way of thinking, or on the other hand of that, kids who are affected by the hate speech and grow up with a sense of inferiority, almost in such as referenced in Brown versus the Board of Education, where they feel as though the inferiority impacted their ability to equal rights, basically. So how do you feel about hate speech when it's directed at vulnerable populations that can be affected and victimized in both directions?
Yeah, absolutely. So how do you deal, I'm repeating for the microphone because I'm recording this, how do you deal with hate speech when it actually does marginalize people, let's say, and you give Brown versus Board of Education as one of the examples. So again, this is a serious issue. I mean, there are a couple issues. Let me take the sort of easy one first, and I'll just rattle it off. Part of what we have to grapple with is the ideas that are leading to, and I'm not a fan of the idea of marginalization or, I forget, you put it in a different way, it's dividing people up into groups, I think, which actually I think is a good way to think about it. There are all sorts of ideas that are prevalent in the culture today that essentially tell people, don't think of yourselves as individuals, think of yourselves as members of society. I think it's a fundamental mistake. You are an individual. It doesn't matter what your skin color is. It doesn't matter what your socioeconomic level is. You are still an individual able to think for yourself, able to understand the world and to decide your place in it and what your course of action should be in your life. And it should not be based on some non-essential group affiliation. That's a really horrible idea. I mean, it's an idea that I think has led to probably more destruction and chaos and just horror through human history than anything. It's collectivism. It's the idea that the individual does not matter, only the group matters. Now, that dovetails with your reference to Brown versus Board of Education. What happened through the American South, slavery, Jim Crow, just to sort of block those 2 points out, was an example of exactly what I'm talking about. It's treating all black people as though they're just a member of a group and they're inferior to everybody else. It is an example of tribalism. And it ought to be looked at as one of the horrifying examples of what happens when people think of themselves as only members of groups. And what I'm talking about here are the white slaveholders in the South, and then by extension, it would be, racists throughout America in general. I don't think everybody was a racist in America, but racism was obviously prevalent. And there were all kinds of horrible ideas that, blacks were inferior to whites. That's a way of essentially saying an individual, this person based on his skin color, is not an individual anymore. We block out his individualism entirely, and we treat him as part of a group, and essentially as a subhuman, like an animal, which is horrible. And that's an idea that is gaining prevalence again today, and it's a really bad idea. Now, Brown versus Board of Education, slavery, and Jim Crow laws, I don't think that's strictly an issue. In fact, I'm positive it's not strictly an issue of speech. So what you had there, and it's not intractable, it's a really difficult problem. I regard the issue of race, slavery, and Jim Crow laws as probably the single most difficult issue this country has ever grappled with. It almost tore the country apart. And in a sense, it should have almost tore the country apart. It was that that important an issue. But it wasn't just an issue of speech. It wasn't that in the South, people were just saying black people are inferior. They had an entire system of laws that was geared to that. So there was more than speech. There was that's an example of actual oppression. Actual oppression by a government or by a majority faction. But I mean, in effect, at that point, it's indistinguishable from one another. So first is slavery. I mean, that's pretty easy to see, I think, right? It's actual laws that enslave, a portion of the population. They're horrible, immoral laws. That has no place in a free society. It was the great, scar or black mark on the founding of this country that they allowed slavery. It was it was a horrible mistake, although in certain ways you can understand the history of it. But it had to manifest itself ultimately in a war. I mean, the war was really the only way you solved that. And then after that, if you have the vestiges of a slave society written into law, that's what Jim Crow laws were all about. That's what segregation was, right? So Brown versus Board of Education is about desegregating the schools. Segregation is not just a matter of saying to black children, you're not as good as white children. It's a matter of saying it, yes, and then backing it up with law, preventing them from actually living a prosperous, free life like all other members of the society. So it's not just speech that accomplishes that. And I actually think, this is sort of a side issue. Reconstruction era, there's a lot to criticize about the way America dealt with Reconstruction. It should have done way more than it did. And if effectively it was the Civil War's over, okay, let's all go back to our lives, right? It should have done way more than that. It should have treated the South as essentially an occupied territory that had just lost a war and instituted all kinds of restrictions on who could hold office. I even think in narrow contexts, and war is really the only one, controlling certain kinds of speech is appropriate. Because what you're trying to do then is reform an entire nation that is effectively being, it's a conquered nation. And if you think about it from the standpoint of there was an entire Southern way of life. It's what Margaret Mitchell, I think, I forget the author of Gone with the Wind, wrote about in Gone with the Wind. The Southern way of life was gone with the wind. Well, it wasn't really gone with the wind at the end of the Civil War. It needed to be driven out, and it wasn't driven out. And that's why you have the civil rights battles from the Civil War all the way up through the 1960s and beyond, because it's still a real issue, and they didn't deal with it the right way. But that's not an issue of free speech. If you have a society in which everybody's rights are protected and treated with respect, and we all treat individuals like, or the government treats people like individuals, things like, I think, racism and bad ideas will ultimately die out. If you prop them up with any kind of support, whether it's affirmative support like segregation laws, or the sort of de facto support that I'm talking about today, they're not going to go away. But part of this is an educational issue that I don't think government itself can solve. No society, for any society to protect itself against bad ideas, people have to choose to believe better ideas. That's an educational issue. There is no way that government can solve that ultimately. But I mean, there's way more to say about that. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask if you could remedy for me this, because I'm maybe it's just me that's having trouble understanding the notion between free speech, the best way to counter hate speech is more speech, and also this idea that you brought up of a designated forum. I would think that in the same way that that designated public forum would choke out sort of this racist speech, I would think that it would also confine the kind of speech that you suggested, this kind of better speech, this better education. And I was wondering how a public university isn't already a forum that's appropriate for that.
Well, so I don't know that I would say, well, here's the problem. So here's the issue. Let me put it like this. A public university, to the extent that it designates areas as public fora, and that includes not only actual physical spaces, but things like it's giving a forum to usually, or it's not, I won't characterize it as good ideas or bad ideas, but it is essentially giving a forum to anybody who wants to access that forum. And it's putting a kind of imprimatur on that speech as speech that people should be listening to. And I think that's just improper for, it's not just a government institution that shouldn't do this, in my view. So if I went to a private university, let's say Florida State were private, I would have, because Richard Spencer spoke there not too long ago, I would oppose, as a student, the private university allowing a guy like that to speak there. And even if you disagree with that, maybe there's some way in which you can say, well, it's good to hear his views debated, but with somebody who's actually intelligent and has good ideas. I mean, there's some value in that, but there are some speakers that I don't think universities or any sane, civilized person should support. The problem with the public forum is it's not just giving voice to good ideas. In fact, it's usually giving voice to crazy ideas or sort of melees. Public forums are almost all, a protest is not the place to learn good ideas. I mean, it's just not. The idea that somehow, you can think of all the protests that have happened, and almost always it's just people blabbering at each other, usually it's shouting, they're marching back and forth. You're not really getting any kind of coherent good ideas. It doesn't work. Even, and to go back to the earlier question, the idea that vulnerable people or marginalized groups somehow win their battles by marching or by agitating a public forum alone, I reject. I think that's even true of the civil rights era. They didn't win solely because they were able to march. They won because they made good arguments. Now, they also won in another way, which was civil disobedience. But civil disobedience is a choice to violate the law. I think that is outside of what I'm talking about. It's not within, the government can't protect the choice to violate the law. So then the question is, was it good or bad? Was it a good strategy? Was it moral? Was it sensible? And did it ultimately lead to good results? And the answer in the civil rights era was yes, it did. But remember, King and the nonviolent protesters, they were willing to violate the law, be arrested, in order to make a spectacle of what was happening in the South. I regard that as a heroic thing. But it's not something that you can say normal operations of civil law somehow protect that. It doesn't make any sense to say the government has to protect the right to ignore the law. That just doesn't go together. There are times and places in which groups should stand up and say, we will not stand for this anymore. We will not comply with these laws. But there's a way to do that that is a sensible way, I think, and I would call it a moral way. That is, I'm not going to attack everybody because I'm being oppressed. I'm going to, respect people who are behaving peacefully, but I am going to oppose the government and what it's doing, and I'm going to force you to arrest me and shoot your water cannons at me and sick your dogs at me, because that will win the moral battle. But that was only part of the argument. Okay, so that was the civil rights protesters making a spectacle and creating an image that this is what it really looks like to live in the South. But King's main arguments All of the civil rights leaders made arguments in context. They had to back those up with arguments. It was the arguments. It wasn't just the spectacle of protesting that won the day. It was the arguments they made, that this is immoral and horrible. King wrote volumes on it. So the idea that just protests and clashes of people in the public square somehow convinces people of anything, I don't think it convinces people of anything at all. I think it does exactly the opposite. Are there other, so I'll come back to you in a minute, but.
I think we have time for one more.
Okay, you did have your hand up? I'll try to be quick and then get to yours. Go ahead.
Okay, so in brief, my question is just basically how far does providing a forum go? Because I feel like you could construe, I don't want to provide this person a forum as an action. And the two examples that I came up with are specifically the Supreme Court case that's coming up that deals with a couple in Colorado, the baker who refused to bake them a cake. And he's claiming free speech. But then the other side of the coin is, could a Cincinnati hotel deny Richard Spencer a room in order to not provide him with a forum?
I think that's it. So how far does public forum go? I think it's a great question, and I basically agree with what you said. So, and I really think that there's room in the law to say, my view, what a public forum can't do is make distinctions based on viewpoint. What it could and should do is make what are known as time, place, and manner distinctions. So you can speak, but it has to be peaceful, no carrying clubs, no confronting Antifa or et cetera. It's a peaceful talk in one corner of the park. We get to decide where that is. I think that would be entirely appropriate. I think it is arguably at least consistent with governing law. Time, place, and manner. I also think it should be appropriate for the hotels to say, Spencer, we don't want you to be in this hotel. And I think it's under governing law, it's probably legal, although there are all kinds of other restrictions. The fact that you raise the individuals who didn't want to bake a cake for gay people, I oppose that. I think they're wrong to believe that. At the same time, I think they have real convictions. That is, they think they're right. It's not just, I hate all gay people. It's my religion tells me, to do this. So I think they're, in essence, in a way, acting in good faith, or they're not lying about it. And they should have that right. That's a right that has to be part of what it means to associate with other people, and that's part of how you solve that, though. Because keep in mind, if we can't discriminate or we can't decide to associate or not associate with good people, logically we shouldn't be able to decide whether to associate or not associate with bad people. And the bad people are making that point. So we have to be free to associate with people or not associate with people. But I actually think there's a solution for this within the law. It wouldn't be my ideal solution, but I think it would be a workable solution where government has more leeway to control the time, place, and manner of speech. But it's a really good question. I don't suppose we have time for one more.
I don't think so.
You can talk to me after if you want. I'm happy to talk more. All right, well, thank you very much. Your questions are all really